All right, we're now recording again. So last time we talked about mandates a lot and sort of the relationships between circles, circles and roles, all those kinds of things. Today we're going to talk about, I'll talk a bit about decision making. So like questions that folks put into the doc to generate this session. There was a question about the advice process. I know there's been some questions about like some of the or like moving proposals through and all that kind of stuff. So talk a little bit about some of the decision-making vehicles. Simon, maybe you can add some stuff here as we go. If you ever want to, just let me know. All right, no more introduction. So yeah, we're going to talk, I'm breaking this down, just want you to have kind of a sense of where we're going to be going. So we're going to talk about the distinction between operations and governance. And how we treat those things very differently from a decision-making point of view. We'll talk about the advice process, which is kind of how we do operations decision-making. We'll talk about integrative decision-making, which is how we do governance decision-making. And we'll go into the details of that, sort of the idea of consent versus consensus. And then we'll try to just talk a bit about like power and decision-making and acknowledge that, you know, we say that it's a hierarchy of purpose, not power, but that's not entirely true. You know, there's just if we're being honest, there are some power issues, and so we'll try to address those a little bit. Before we start into any of those things, though, I just want to talk about some kind of underlying principles of how the SO, like some of the values that inform, I think, the way that this methodology deals with decision making, or like beliefs or assumptions that are kind of underlying this. So one of these is that, and we talked a bit about this last time, like this approach, this methodology, part of it is really based on like getting past trying to find the best solution to a problem. So there's not a big emphasis on like really focusing on best decisions or like really focusing on each decision intensely. Finding the best solution, or like what even is the best solution to a problem, in part it depends on, you know, information we do have available, but a lot of it depends on information that we just don't, like at any given time we don't have, you know, all the information to make like the best decision. And then what the best decision is totally based on, you know, subjective valuations and philosophy. So a part of this methodology is saying like which specific decision we make, like there's probably 10 or 20 equally good decisions that we're capable of making right now. And rather than like, you know, split hairs and like spend our time really picking between one of those 20, you know, the best of those, one of those 20 good ones, we kind of put our energy elsewhere. So instead we focus on trying to make decisions quickly. I got a little carried away with the Dilbert comics, as you're going to see in this slideshow. So get ready for lots of Dilbert comics. But I think they speak to our subject today very well. So, you know, we've all experienced probably like meeting burnout in XR. This is something often talked about, is there's just like too many meetings, or everyone feels like we're in too many meetings. And so, you know, one way that we try to address this is just like, let's accept, if we can find a decision that's kind of good enough, who's like safe enough, good enough for now, safe enough to try. These are two sayings that I hope you will sort of become part of your vocabulary if they're not already. When we're testing decisions, like we're not looking for the best decision. We're looking for something that's good enough for now. We'll change it later. And it's safe enough to try. We'll say a bit more about what those things mean in a second. So we focus on, reevaluating decisions when the data improves. So that good enough for now is like I said, it's, you know, we have some of the information we'd want to make this decision now, but a lot of it we could only possibly gather by trying something, right? So that's the scientific method, is like we have a hypothesis, we test it, and then we say, okay, did it work or did it not? So a lot of these decisions, that's how like this methodology again would really think about decision making, or encourage us to think about decision making in terms of like, okay, let's test this idea and let's track it and see how it goes, and then we'll know whether or not it was, you know, whether or not it had the outcome we wanted, and then we'll try the next thing based on how well that one went. And finally, we put a big focus, and we talked about this last time too, on preserving trust and goodwill. So any specific decision like is not as important as our relationships, the culture, like our togetherness. And that togetherness and kind of mutual love in an organization like this, if we can maintain that, then we can endure any kind of like internal crisis or external crisis. And if we can't maintain that, then we could make all the right decisions and we're still kind of totally screwed. I hope that, let me know if you need more time for the Dilbert comics too, because I really think they spiced up this presentation. Okay. So yeah, just review, like, because we think we're a bit skeptical of like this sort of best decision approach. I think there's lots of perfectly good decisions. So we focus instead on trying to make a decision quickly. So we spend less time making the decision and more time implementing it. Like a decision that isn't, decision without execution might as well not have happened. So if we spend all of our time making decisions and none of our time implementing those decisions, and we're not doing anything. And then, reevaluating the decision when the data improves, and focusing underneath all of this on maintaining our trust and goodwill. Or at least we try to. That's the ideal, right? Oh, this is the principle. This is what we're aiming for. Doesn't always happen. Much easier said than done. And I think a big part of that is because there's like just certain habits. I don't know if it's like human nature or things that we've learned in our, like, from the society that we've grown up in, but in my time in groups, in XR and in other groups that I talked a bit about last time, I've seen a lot of very consistent kind of patterns of like how some of our like really common tendencies work against this approach to collaboration and decision making. And so I'm just going to name a couple of those like habits that I want to invite you to maybe start to notice or be aware of. And most, like all of these, like I have noticed in myself more than anywhere else. So sorry if this is too biographical. So list of totally understandable habits that undermine organization, self-organizing and autonomy. One is we just, like people, we really want to tell other people what they can't do. I really like this quote from Margaret J. Wheatley, who is I'm pretty sure this quote is from the book Leadership in the New Science. Self-organization is not a startling new feature of the world. It is the way the world has created itself for billions of years. In all of human activity, self-organization is how we begin. It is what we do until we interfere with the process and try to control one another. So we talked last time about this idea that's like, oh, it's such a relief. Like if I know what my role is, I know what my piece of the sort of purpose of the organism is, then it's such a relief to not have to worry about all the other pieces. Like I can just trust, okay, that part is that person's and that part is that team's, and I have my part and I'm going to deal with this until, something goes horribly wrong, and then I'll try to help, but whatever. Like I know what my responsibility is. That's great in theory, but in practice, like that's really, it's that can be a real struggle to like think that way. And it can also be valid because you could be like looking at what someone's doing and they could be having a lot of trouble or really screwing it up. And you think, this is really bad. I need to do something. And there's this tension in self-organizing where we've said, like, when you see a problem, you have a responsibility to do something about it. So how do we juggle those things? But just noticing, like, going back to that principle of like, well, it's, there's probably several decisions, and sometimes it's hard for us to differentiate between like, is that person making a bad decision or are they just not making the decision that I would have made? So this is a really strong, people really want to tell each other what we can't do. Another one is what's called the law of triviality. Who's heard of this before? Anyone raising a hand? Okay, great. So the law of triviality, it's very simple. It says that the time spent on a decision will be inversely proportional to its importance. And the example of the person who sort of first articulated this, and it's like a law of like sociology and kind of organizational dynamics. And the person who first articulated it gave the example of like, if a community committee was assembled to like make a plan for building a new nuclear reactor. Well, building a nuclear reactor is like extremely complicated. And the people in the community don't have the expertise. Like, it requires a ton of expertise and it's extremely complicated. The people in the community don't have the, they don't know about nuclear reactors. So they get together and they don't really know what to say about the nuclear reactor. And they just like trust whoever says, oh, I know about nuclear reactors. And so they spend barely any time talking about the nuclear reactor, but there's the bike shed for the people who work at the nuclear reactor. That's just like down at the bottom, for people to bike to work. Everyone knows about bikes. Like, everyone can have an opinion about bike sheds, and they really want to feel like we want to feel like there's a reason we're on this team, right? So we just obsess, the community obsesses over the bike shed, and they spend like 100 times as much time talking about arguing about the design of the bike shed and going back and forth over different bike shed proposals, and no one pays attention to the nuclear reactor. So that's the law of triviality, and sometimes called bike shedding. And yeah, definitely have also seen this in groups.
Aidan, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to get my head around this is really interesting. So the law of triviality, is it basically saying that people can end up doing stuff that is trivial because they can do it and it's easier? Is that what you mean? Or is it am I slightly missing the point?
No, that's pretty close. So like, an even more concise statement of it would be like that groups tend to focus on the least important issues. Like, groups tend to spend a lot of their time focusing the things that aren't important and neglect the things that are important. And a big part of the reason for that is exactly what you said, is that like a lot of times there's sort of simple things that actually matter a lot less. Like, if we could just tell someone, hey, go come up with the bike shed, and it's going to be good enough, right? Like, it's going to work for the nuclear reactor. We should be focusing on the big important thing. But Phil says comfort zone. Yeah, right. Like things that we're familiar with. Yeah, I think y'all get it. And then a final kind of habit is, well, let me take a second to read my Doubler comic here. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, good. So it's really easy to mistake dysfunction for deception. So, and what I mean by this, and sorry if the second sentence there is like not very descriptive. When I'm working with like on my team with people, and I know the people I'm working with, and we're having like weekly meetings, and I see that something's not working, like my tendency is to sort of think, oh, like, something's not working, like this person's really overwhelmed, or like I'm hearing their check-in, I know they're like having family stuff or whatever it is. Like I sort of like have this, I don't really hold that person. It's a lot easier for me to not like build up a lot of anger at that person. But when something's like not happening in like a team that's far away from me, that I like don't have a lot of interaction with, there's a really strong tendency to sort of assume like malintent. And this is the stuff of conspiracy theories, right? This is where all of conspiracy theories in our society come from, is that when we see something weird happening or something that's like, not working, our brains seem to just be hardwired to like, think that it's a result of nefarious intent. And we think there must be some secret cabal somewhere that plotted to, create the coronavirus or blow up the Twin Towers or whatever it is. And the vast majority of the time, it's actually just like incompetence, right? Like most of, like the government doesn't work. We shouldn't trust it, mostly because it's just like horrendously incompetent. And the same, unfortunately, goes for us. Like we're all pretty, we're all struggling. We're all, very imperfect. We're all very distractible. We make promises and then don't follow through on them because we get distracted, or because, other things, usually not because we were intending to deceive you, right? And most of us know that that's true for us, and it can be hard. And it's easy to extend that courtesy to people we know and interact with. But people we don't know, it becomes very difficult. And we tend to have the opposite kind of habit. So again, in kind of review, some sort of natural behaviors, whether they're socially learned or just human nature, that get in the way of this approach to decision making. just the urge to tell other people what they can't do, the urge to kind of focus on simple things that we can understand rather than potentially the things that are important, which tend to be a little more complex. Not always. And a bit of a sort of tendency towards distrust with people we don't know, a tendency to assume that if something's not working, it's because of someone's intention rather than simply people being overwhelmed. What's up, Simon?
Just to add kind of a personal reflection on that last one, because I've seen this happening. I think this can occur even amongst people that do know each other quite well, but in a different way. And I think it arises from expectations, but expectations that aren't voiced. So if you think, or if you would like someone to be doing something in a certain way, or just to be doing something full stop, but you either haven't felt brave enough or you just haven't told them that that's where you are, then it's very difficult really for you to expect them to fulfill it in that way. If no one's psychic, even if they know you very well.
Yeah, there are a lot of there are several anecdotes in the book Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg where he talks about like people realizing that like something that they've been, you know, frustrated or annoyed, like for instance, like in a married couple, like someone realizing that something that they've been really frustrated with or annoyed with for years, and that they've never once actually said to their partner, like, I want you to do this thing, or I'm wanting this thing from our relationship, like, and it's this like revelation, like, oh my God, how like they didn't even realize that we don't realize that we haven't communicated our expectations. That's very common. There's also just you know, a curiosity. Like one of my mentors just like constantly saying like, stay curious, stay curious, stay curious to, you know, to all of us. Because it's just like, okay, yeah, someone is doing something differently than I want them to be doing. And maybe they have a reason for the way that they're doing it. It may not be a good reason, you know, it may not, I mean, it's still not agree with it once I know the reason, but like starting with like wanting to understand what's the reason that they're doing it that way. And that is hard. It's easier said than done. Like I said a few slides ago. Okay, so going to move on into the specific things that I talked about. I would take another question right now if there is one. Paul.
Just thinking about the last one, mistaking dysfunction for deception. I assume the transparency is really if you can demystify the deception, then you can sort of, it's better to expose the dysfunction than it is to, you know, have it mistaken for deception. It's better that dysfunction isn't there, but like obviously things will arise. Is that, I mean, yeah, it's a radical transparency, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, of course, yeah, yes. It's absolutely a call for transparency. And it's also a reminder about, well, in some ways, yeah, like absolutely and totally like, if you've exposed to dysfunction, that's like something we can all collaborate on. And like people probably want help. Like people, if your need isn't getting met and it's because of dysfunction, people probably would like to better know how they can support, you know, or how they can get that thing for you. What I'm almost pointing to is like the opposite side of the relationship, or the opposite side of the transaction, like from transparency. So I'm almost putting the onus on like, I think trusting people is a skill. It's like a muscle that we have to like work on, and sort of having that curiosity and like openness is a muscle. And so I'm inviting, like, we need to like work on our transparency. We need to work on our like making, you know, trying to prevent other people having this experience of us. And we also need to like work on our like, okay, I'm feeling really frustrated about, you know, Simon's not getting back to me about this thing. And like, why might that be? Calling me out. Ha! All right, Simon, what's up?
Just to pick up on something that Paul said, Paul, when you said, talking about dysfunction, you know, ideally it wouldn't be there, my instinctive reaction was, yeah, I totally agree. And then I thought, no, because if we don't have dysfunction, we have a perfect system, and there is no perfect system. So I guess dysfunction probably has a lot of connotations in our minds, but we need to keep moving towards this idea that if we can identify and actually talk about things that aren't working, that's how we improve. That's the recipe for success.
Yeah, and I feel a little guilty for making my word choice here for the balance of dysfunction and deception when, you know, if I wasn't doing that and I was trying to be more communicative, then I might have said tension, which is our SOS word for things. Okay, I'm going to move on. So that's a bit of the SOS decision-making theory or the principles behind it. So now we're going to talk about SOS, what the practice is. But still, this is what the practice is in theory. This may not be what you've experienced in XR. I don't know. But in theory, this is how we do it. So you've noticed a problem. And this whole presentation could be a flowchart. And in some organizations, they have very nice flowcharts. I like the flowchart approach. The first question you want to ask, well, maybe the first question you want to ask is this problem worth pursuing? Like, is this a big enough problem that like, because there's an energy cost to pursuing this problem. And you may need to do a little more investigation before you're able to answer that. So you may need to answer, for instance, this next question first. But eventually you get to the point of saying, okay, I think this problem is like the one that I want to focus on right now. Versus now I'm going to focus on a different problem first. And then maybe later, if we've solved a bunch of other problems, then this problem will become worth focusing on. But then once you've answered that question, you are concerned with the question, is it a operations problem or a governance problem? And the way that we think about this is like, does this deal, so is this sort of an issue that like I think would already be clear in the in like you know, this is a problem that relates to an existing mandate, and it could be my mandate or it could be someone else's, but like, you know, it seems like pretty clear that there's already someone who is meant to deal with this kind of problem. Like, oh, you know, there's some kind of big thing happening in the news. Like that's, you know, that's pretty clearly M&M's thing to deal with. So that's if yes, it's operations. If no, it's probably governance. We'll pretend for now that it's that simple. So if it's operations, we're going to talk about how it's operational decision first. I like this comic. I'm sure that some of you feel this way about the advice process, or are worried that it might manifest this way. So the advice process is how in XR we approach operational decisions. And the idea is either we've created a mandate already in order to delegate this to someone. And so like maybe to step back, and I think, yeah, like I think we touched on this last week a little bit, but the approach here is like, okay, we want to make decisions really efficiently. We want to make decisions quickly. If you get 100 people together to try to make a decision, you might like have the most perspectives integrated, and you might be able to spend over 10 years and like make the best decision, like a citizens assembly. If we took a citizens assembly approach to every single decision, we'd probably have like the best decisions. But that, you know, if we did that, then all we would ever be doing is being in citizens assemblies. So for most decisions, the approach here is like, we want to just like identify, okay, this decision is probably going to need to be made a bunch, and put it in a, like, tell someone, okay, now you go make that decision. You're responsible for it. If something goes horribly wrong, we'll come talk to you. But like, for the most part, we're just trusting you with this. And the advice process is how that person goes and says, okay, well, ultimately I've been mandated. I have this contract with my circle where they told me to do this thing. And on the opposite side of that, I get to do it however I want, or I get to make whatever decisions I think are best. But I don't want to be like just totally left alone, right? I don't want to be totally out in the dark and like, you know, have like I want to be in communication with people. I want to have, so that's, you know, it's not just about people being totally on their own. So I use the advice process. This is Frederick Lalo's description of the advice process. In principle, any person in the organization can make any decision. And then we'll add this caveat for XR and many other methodologies. Any decision that does not impact on a domain or on scarce resources. But before doing so, that person must seek advice from all affected parties and people with experience on the matter. The person is under no obligation to integrate every piece of advice. The point is not to achieve a watered-down compromise that accommodates everybody's wishes. But the advice must be sought and taken into serious consideration. The bigger the decision, the wider the net must be cast, including, when necessary, the CEO or the board of directors. He's talking about a specific company in this anecdote. Usually the decision maker is the person who noticed the issue or the opportunity, or the person most affected by it. So a couple, yeah. So this clause, person must seek advice from all affected parties. Well, okay, let's pause. Yeah, big kind of paradigm shift here. And probably most of you have already been exposed to kind of some version of this. So it may not be a paradigm shift in this moment, but generally speaking, the advice process is a big paradigm shift from other like approaches to decision making, whether that's hierarchy or consensus. We're saying basically anyone, any person in the organization can make any decision unless we've already specified that someone else should make those specific decisions, or unless they need to spend money on it or whatever. Before doing so, that person must seek advice from all affected parties, and people with expertise on the matter. Who decides who is an affected party? Who is the arbiter of what affected parties are and who has expertise on the matter? Does anyone have an answer? Maya, I just saw that your hand is up. I'm sorry, did I miss that a while ago?
No. It's a question relating to your previous slide, but probably fits better when you've finished talking about the advice process.
Okay, let's grab that then. So, so who decides who is affected by a decision or who has expertise on it? Somebody. Who is it?
Well, I usually go with what Mickey says about this.
Trust Mickey. Oh, sorry. You mean
Mickey Cashtan, not Mickey Cashtan, not Mickey Mouse.
No, it's just funny. It sounded like you meant, oh, I just go ask Mickey who is affected by this decision or who is an expert on it.
Not like
but no,
that.
also sure. So what does Mickey say?
Well, she says that people who are affected are the ones who are immediately impacted by a decision. But sometimes that's everybody. So then you still need to choose because you can't necessarily talk to everybody. And another group of people, I think that Frederic Laloux also identified, are people who have some knowledge about it, expertise, that you'd also want to include in the advice.
Right, so the question is, who decides who those people are for a particular decision?
Well, to some extent, the people themselves, if they feel really affected, and to some extent, the person with a mandate or the person who notices the issue.
Right.
And then,
so basically, whoever is going through, that's right. So whoever is doing this, the decision maker decides who to seek advice from. And that may seem like a big, like, oh, isn't that the sort of unaccountable, like they can just decide, oh, I'm not going to seek advice from anyone. Or like, there may seem like there's an issue there, but yeah, the decision maker decides who to seek advice from. And the idea is actually, it's because this is advice. Like the whole dynamic of this is we're trusting people to make decisions, and the advice process is actually to serve them. The advice process is saying, like, we want to support you in getting the information you need to be able to make the decision that you feel, good about, and that is going to benefit the organization because you care about the organization. That's the only reason we'd be trusting you to make these decisions, is because we all care about this shared purpose. The advice process is about helping you get the information you think you need, and trusting that you're going to care about, who are the people who are affected enough by this that they really need to input on it. Ultimately, everyone is affected by every decision practically in an organization. So that's, very much a judgment issue. And we might sometimes disagree with each other's judgment. Etienne.
So this is quite incredible. It's really remarkable. So what you're saying, that if you're a person who is either mandated with this decision, as in it fits in your thing, or you are tasked somehow, or you've noticed a problem and you've given yourself the task of trying to get on it, you basically decide who to ask about it.
Mm-hmm.
That seems quite interesting, because then you would sort of think to yourself, because you're trying to make a good decision, you would people would trust you to say, okay, I think this person is trying to make a good decision, therefore they'll think about who best to ask, and based on the criteria that they're looking for. So they might be in a hurry, or they might be like, we really need to bring everyone along on this, or
Right.
X, Y, or Z, what other criteria. So that is actually quite remarkable to think of that. So I'm quite interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, and you named a factor there
That's the right thing to
yeah, that's
say.
right.
Yeah.
And you named a really important factor there, which is sometimes we're suddenly in a position of needing to make a decision that's going to affect a lot of people, and we don't have nearly enough time to get advice, to get all those people's input. And so the threshold here is very fluid, where where we're deciding who needs to be talked to, who do we have time to talk to, and assessing that threshold is a skill, and it's a skill that unfortunate, like we're bringing people into our organization who don't have that skill yet, and they're going to make decisions, and sometimes they're going to make really shit decisions. Like that's a big part of this whole thing, is like, if you're not ready to accept real shit decisions, then don't do self-organizing. Like go back to hierarchy land, because this is the land of some shit decisions happening. What's up, Simon?
Yeah, I was gonna say a very, very similar thing. Within self-organization, we really need to embrace the idea that we implement these things, but if they're not working, we can reimagine them, we can redo them, and that is how we grow. I think another one of these kind of habits that we have is we want everything to be kind of perfect first time, so we don't have to worry about it anymore. But it's really hard to develop a perfect, firstly, there's no perfect solution to anything. It's really hard to develop something approaching that the first time around.
Right. And sort of part of it is like saying, well, I bet if we spend, rather than spending 10 hours making one decision, if we spend, half an hour making 10 decisions, we'll have spent 5 hours instead of 10 hours, and we're still more likely to have one of those 10 decisions be the right one. So maybe we make a first decision on something, we make it really quickly, and we're like, well, that didn't work. Let's make another one. Let's make another one. Let's make another one. And we'll find a good one rather than spending 10 hours deliberating over it. And there is a cost to that sometimes. That's not to say like none of these decisions ever come with a cost. It's to say we kind of accept, like this methodology is the one that accepts that cost. All right. And when it comes to the advice process, many of you will have probably found what the next slide is about, is that usually the biggest obstacle is not people not seeking advice from the right people. Sometimes that happens. But usually the biggest obstacle is people getting back to you, like people not giving their advice. People are busy and we don't make time for each other. Or we're legitimately busy and we just genuinely can't input, or we're asked to give advice on, 20 different things because of our role. So what if you're having a hard time getting engagement on a request for advice? Someone, that's a question. What's up, Etienne? Oh, I'm sorry. I lost track of your question, but I will get to it after this slide. Etienne.
Yeah, I was just saying, I guess you need to ask people who are interested in it. That's
part of that's gonna determine who's affected by it, is who's interested enough to respond to your request. That's a big part of it. Lucy?
No, you can leave me for later on. It was another question. I'll put my hand down.
Okay. We will take a pause for more general questions, basically, right after. Yeah, on this slide. Yeah. So if you ask someone for advice, like one way to think about this dynamic, and this is the way I'm not suggesting, but it does kind of work. If you ask for someone's advice and then they don't get back to you, and then you make your decision, and then they're like, hey, I don't like this decision. You can at least say, hey, I gave you a chance to input on it and you didn't get back to me. And that's legit. And that's one reason you could think about, who you're going to ask for advice. And then another, the more hopefully constructive way of thinking about it is like, well, we try to have this approach, like Simon was saying, of like, we want our decisions to be very impermanent. Like we try to make, we try to design our decisions in such a way that they can be revisited. And if someone, you know, it's like the best advice is trying the decision and then getting the universe's advice about whether that was a good decision. And so, you know, we tend, like, the suggestion here would be, anytime you're asking for advice on anything, say, like, you know, hey, I've got this proposal, like I'm sending it out. You have this is going to be open for 3 days. I'll integrate advice for the next 3 days, and then I'm moving, and then I'm going to make a decision and move forward. Like open-ended requests, they don't help me because it's like, if I get an open-ended request, then I'll just postpone it endlessly. But also it's just like, you know, yeah, really put a frame on that. And if people don't want to input, like Etienne said, that it can be kind of a good enough signal that so maybe it, you know, take it as a signal that they're trusting you with it. Like usually that's the case for me. If I see a big ass proposal and I'm like, oh, I don't really have time to like input on this, I also accept that, like, oh, okay, I guess that means I'm trusting whoever this is. Like if I'm not gonna input on it, that means it's theirs. Okay, let me remind myself what's on the next slide and just make sure that this is where I wanted to stop. Okay, yep. So let's take questions. Maya and then Lucy.
Thanks, Aidan. Maybe just, I have in mind an example of what you're talking about there, about the Heathrow decision, the Heathrow action last year. I remember Larch saying that he did send the proposal to a number of working groups for input, and he only got input from 2 working groups, or 3 maybe, and then actions went ahead and made the decision to have this action at Heathrow, which turned out to be one of the most controversial things happening in XR in the UK last year, and even beyond the borders. So that was a very clear example of what happens if you then, you know, take the decision and then people respond after you make the decision, and what everything that can flow from that can be and how big that can become. That was quite interesting. But the reason I put my hand up was that at the first slide, on the first slide about the advice process, it said for operational decisions. I'm wondering whether that was just sort of coincidence or whether there's a particular reason that you think this is not something to use for governance decisions.
So the reasoning is that in governance, like no one is empowered to make governance decisions by themselves. So governance decisions actually have a more formal process, which is the next thing we're going to discuss, is governance decisions have a more formal process for integrating different people's perspectives. So the threshold is actually higher for governance decisions. Maya, I wonder what you think now of the anecdote you just shared about Heathrow Pause, and it sounds like a snafu with the advice process where someone was making a decision. They asked lots of teams for advice. They only got advice back from a few teams, and then it turned out to be very controversial.
I mean, it led to a lot of soul searching, debate, pain, revision of how things were done. You know, some realization that in hindsight, it might have been helpful to be a bit more persistent about getting input from various teams. And yeah, a new protocol of how to make such decisions came out of it.
So,
does that answer your question, or do you want like a personal opinion about things?
I kind of want your personal opinion about it.
Well, I feel like it would have been really helpful if, because that's one thing I see a lot in XR. It wasn't necessarily a full-on advice process that was being attempted there. It was like, you know, the sort of typical thing of, here's a proposal, send it to some people in email by email and hope that they'll respond, as opposed to maybe really identifying what would be required for a full advice process. I think that was part of the problem. That, you know, people feel like, okay, I send it to these different relevant circles, even if 10 circles or so, that should be enough, but maybe it's not fully thought through. And yeah, I've seen that again and again in XR cases where I feel like that's how people tend to ask for input and feedback. But if they actually try and do like a full advice process, that probably lead to much less tension, which is not necessarily the ideal. We need to learn to deal with tensions. But on the other hand, when you see just how much pain and how much frustration and how many people getting close to burnout because they don't have the resilience skills to deal with that kind of situation, then yeah, maybe it would have been nice if it could have been sorted out in a different way.
Steph, is that a hand?
I was just reflecting on that time and being a local coordinator and a survey going out. Heathrow's in my region, and there was an overwhelming response. I think maybe 90% of people were against that action, and we fed that information back. So I'm not sure how that worked in the SOS, but yeah, I just put my hand up and then down because it's just a comment, not actually helpful.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you know, this delicate stuff here. Like, one, if we go back to this quote from Lalo, like, we are empowering people by adopting this methodology. We're empowering someone to go and talk to, like, be making a decision and talk to every person like they think would be affected by it. Talk to 20 people and have all 20 of those people tell them, I think this is a really garbage idea, and I think it would be terrible if you did it. And we're empowering that person to still do it. Like, we are saying, as long as that person has listened and seriously considered, like, and taken that, like, okay, as long as that person can articulate, and only they are the judge of whether they can articulate this sufficiently. As long as they can articulate, okay, I've heard why these folks, I really understand what these folks are worried about, whether, and I either still believe that it won't have the outcome that they're worried about, or that the outcome that they're worried about is acceptable because it'll have this other outcome that's good enough, or that the outcome they're worried about will actually be a good thing. Like, we're allowing for that. Now, that I would hope would be extremely rare, that someone, that would have, pretty much, yeah. Like, and when, yeah, not a common thing, but we have to, I think, notice that. That's tricky, and it's also, yeah, so we've moved so much past, like, we're not in hierarchical decision making, we're not in consensus decision making, we're not in majority decision making, like any of the three paradigms that we're used to and are in I think, at least that I had experienced before being in this kind of place, where we're kind of flying in the face of these things. And decisions could happen in a self-organizing methodology that could not happen under any of those other three. What's up, Etienne?
Yeah, I was just sort of reflecting. I guess the decisions and things that come out of a self-organizing system are judged from the paradigm of these other places, right? And that's why they can't really understand why things that might look a bit crazy might happen in the self-organizing system, because they're coming from a different place, So it seems to me like that's what I often spend myself quite a lot of time explaining to people, that because it's a self-organizing system, people can do kind of what they want. We can't control them as long as we think they're trying in good faith to act in the principles and values, but everyone is judging it from a really, hierarchical power over type paradigm, which means that it's difficult to understand, I think. And that, I guess, is very hard, even because for me, I'm completely steeped in that paradigm. And so therefore it is quite difficult to understand why something like these so-called bad decisions happen that seem to affect a lot of people. But it's because we can't kind of quite see it from this other way. And it is difficult to get your head around the fact that these things could happen. It's kind of scary, isn't it?
Yeah, and I that's a very astute way of putting it. And what's different about these different paradigms is, like, on a very fundamental level, some of the assumptions or values. And that was what I was trying to address kind of at the beginning of these slides, is like, so when it comes to, like, yeah, that valuing autonomy, or that big emphasis on, like, people kind of being able to do what they think is like being able to make decisions that they think that they believe in, do what they think, act on whatever they think is the best decision, even if many other people, or even if a large majority of the group disagrees. This might result in like bad decisions, or it might result in like cost to the organization. Certainly 90% of people think a decision might result in like a serious harm to the organization. Let's just quickly think for a second about the harm to the organization of like from the other side. Like what the harm to the organization of letting the majority rule, or of letting consensus block things. So like it's the harm of like over time if I come into XR and I find self-organizing spaces to be like incredibly motivating, because I have the belief that if I go in and start working on something and I'm like in good faith and I listen to people, I still have my autonomy, and it's like a place that I can like express my beliefs even when I disagree. And even a majority like can't come in at like I have the safety to know that if I work on a project and I work hard on it, I'm gonna have the chance to try it. And I'm like a majority can't come in at the end, like when I'm 90% of the way there, even though I tried to get feedback from it and people didn't feed in or whatever, and say, shut it down, throw out your work, whatever. And if that happened to me, and it has happened to me in other contexts, like over time, I leave. I'm super demotivated, and I see other people become super demotivated. So there's a different kind of harm to the organization actually when we enable that habit I talked about early on, this urge we have to police each other and control each other. When we feed into that and enable that, there's a different kind of harm that comes. And like I was, like Simon and I were saying, it's like in this methodology, there's a value. It's totally a value judgment and assumption that's underlying this methodology, is that saying we think that harm is worse than the harm of specific decisions. And you might not agree with, like, that's not a universal truth, right? They're different. They're very difficult things to compare to each other. So you might be hearing this and be like, well, I don't fucking agree with that at all. And that's totally okay. And then I'm doing my best to, good faith represent what I think that, this kind of way of thinking is. So Lucy, what's up?
Yeah, I guess what I don't understand, if we have all this autonomy to make decisions, why people are blocking people's decision making and interfering and stalling processes, then, if that's the case.
That's a very valid, yeah. I don't know if you want me to answer to a specific thing, I could do my best, but I think in general, it's like, it's not healthy. That's not what a healthy self-organism looks like.
So then, yeah, that's the answer. Then it's not a healthy, but yeah, in particular, like this budget working group and now the financial review group, that's something that was meant to be set up quickly for an immediate need to help decide where, the money even this month was going. Instead, it's been dragged out, and it won't even get started now until probably after May. So then that decision with finance has been left in the hands of one person that nobody wanted that to happen, including apparently the person. Yet this has been dragged out by, other circles interfering with the process.
Yeah, definitely. You're the frustration and mourning, and that like totally like empathize on a deep level with that exact frustration of like this decision that's important to me is like getting dragged out, and that's the whole, in some ways, yeah, that's kind of what the energy behind all of this is trying to prevent. I see a bunch of hands. Other folks may have information on it. If we may want to discuss this more fully after the next topic, because I don't know whether, it may be elucidate like some governance, or it may be helpful to talk about the other decision-making methodology first, and I know some of you are familiar with it, but just kind of want to like refloat also that
yeah, it would be really helpful, I think.
Okay, well, let's do it then. So integrative decision making, this is the process. So if this is what happens, you get to that, you notice a problem, and you're thinking, okay, this doesn't seem to fit inside of anyone's mandate. You actually have two choices. One is you can say, well, I'm going to fix it, and you go and do it, and you actually use the advice process, and you just say, I'm just fucking doing this. It's not from any role, but I'm trying to help. And in a healthy, in my ideal self-organizing world, I'll stop making general judgments. What I would like to see, the organization I would want to be in, we would say, that's awesome. You want to help? Great. Power to you. You don't have a mandate and you're taking on this extra responsibility. That's great. But also a totally valid way to say it is, well, actually, I think this decision needs to be made frequently, or like, this seems like really, this is a problem that's going to keep coming up. Or you could even say, well, I solved this problem the first time and now it's come up a second time. Let's talk about it from a governance perspective. So governance is where we try to build the shape of the structure of the organism to be one that can address these kinds of problems in the future by itself. Or where we won't be, like governance is where we try to prevent predictable problems from coming up in the future. I'm using integrated decision making for that. What's up, Yichen?
So you're saying there that, if it's something that keeps coming up, it's a problem that keeps coming up, then it becomes like a governance thing. You're trying to think about a system to sort of solve it on a more longer term basis.
And maybe the word I wish I'd used instead of problem was need. Like if we've identified a recurring need, then we try to plug it,
And then, or if it is not fitting in or if it doesn't, if it already fits into someone's mandate, that's when you can do this second thing. So governance is when it's like, doesn't, if a problem keeps coming up or it fits into another mandate and you think
so
it needs to.
Let me actually, great clarification. So if it fits into someone else's mandate and you go to them and say, hey, can you deal with this? That would be an operational problem. If it fits into someone else's mandate, it should be an operational problem. You go and say, hey, I've noticed this problem. Can you deal with this? If they then say, that's not my mandate, that's not my problem, now it's a governance problem because there's a misalignment of expectations. If you are like, I'm pretty sure it is, like, I'm looking at your mandate here and I really think this fits, and they're like, that's not how I read this, then you want to use governance to align the expectations. So that needs to be, if there's a disagreement about what a mandate means, that's actually manifesting in like an operational tension, then we try to resolve that in governance. And the hope is, well, we all just want clarity. We all want to know what we can expect of each other, what's expected of us, and then we all want these needs to be met. So, there's lots of possible solutions, and hopefully we'll try to be okay with. We try to come up with one that works for everyone.
Can I just check that once more?
Yeah,
so I want to be super clear because it's really good. So if a problem keeps coming up, it's a governance thing. Yeah. Or if it's not in an existing mandate, then it's a governance.
If it's not in an existing mandate and it keeps it's not exactly as scientific as that, unfortunately.
No, I understand. So
so if it keeps coming up, it's possible that it's still on so like it may be that someone's the best way to the surest thing that it's a governance problem is if there's different expectations. If one person says, I think we should be able to expect this from you, and that person says, I don't think that, then it's a governance issue for sure. And then another possible governance issue is, well, we all agree that we should be able to expect this from someone because this need keeps coming up and we need to address it. Then that would be a governance issue. Okay, so it's a sort of linear process, and many of you probably all of you have experienced this, but still valuable to sort of talk about. I'll get into, just quickly some kind of details of it. So the integrated decision-making is based around proposals So it's not, this isn't a process for coming up with a proposal. You could use any kind of process for coming up with a proposal. And some of you have experienced convergent facilitation, which I think is a really good process for like generating proposals or generating solutions to a problem. And that could even happen before this. So these two things could happen in tandem. But so by some means, someone is approach, like the integrative decision-making process starts when someone says, well, I've noticed this problem and here's the solution that I think would work. Here's the solution that would work for me. And we start there. So in the IDM process, we start with presenting the proposal. And I'm trying to make this very simple because it can feel very magical and complicated, and I want to reduce it down to something that feels very simple and that you can forever remember and understand. So present the proposal, and then we have 3 rounds of response. So the first round, and basically everyone on the team gets to input in every round. So the first round is for clarifying questions. And this is really encourage SOS facilitators, and please all of you be helpful and kind and generous to your facilitator, or even if you're self-facilitating, that's even more important to be doing this, to be very strict about tracking that you're only asking like something you don't understand about the proposal. So if someone goes and says, well, don't you think that like this is gonna, don't you think that we could do better by doing this, X, Y, Z? Your facilitator should say, save that for the reaction round. That's not a clarifying question. So clarifying questions are just like, I don't understand something about what's in your proposal. Can you clarify it for me? Great. So really, really like to keep it nice and strict there. And just, the feeling being that it's really unfair to everyone, and it's hard to kind of explain why it sort of degrades the process so much if we start to drift from clarifying questions in the first round. Then we get into reactions. And this, the reaction round of the integrated decision-making process is this really magical moment. We talked last week, I think, and we're going to talk more a bit later about like the idea that you're representing a role, right? Actually, maybe we didn't talk about this as much. Let me see what's on my next slide here. Okay, I never talked about this. All right. I don't have a slide for it. I'm just going to put it on this slide so that you can pay attention to me. When you are in a circle, or like anytime like we're in the operational or governance space, you're there in a role. Like you're there because of the role that you're in. You're not just there because, oh, you know, we got together and we decided that Susan and Paul and Etienne and Steph should be like the executive directors of XR UK. And we put them on the Rebel Hive circle, and like they're in charge now. You're not, that's not why you're there, right? You're there because you have a role, and you're there filling that role. And that role has like a perspective that's governed by like what its mandate is. So your role is that you're there to advocate for the thing for your contract, right? The thing you've been told to do. And it's like it's important where, yeah, we will talk about this more in a second, but generally speaking, you're always kind of showing up in your role to like operational issues and governance meetings. The one exception is in the reaction round of the integrative decision-making process. In this round, you become yourself. You become all the other parts of you get to come in, and you are totally free to react just like whatever you think, like how, just authentically react to the proposal. Like say like, wow, you know, I really think this, like, well, yeah, okay, I'll say that in a second. You just share your, like what you think and what you see, and share whatever it is, you know, about that role that's like, that you feel the need to share. And sometimes if it's like a short proposal and we're, you know, it doesn't seem that important, you try to like not share that much. But if it's a big important one and you feel it's really big and important, you can share a lot here. And then, so at the end of the reaction round, the proposer has the opportunity, based on what they've heard from the reactions, they might suggest that they have the opportunity to sort of amend it and say, oh, you know, I really liked Suzanne's suggestion, and I really hear Etienne's concern, so I'm going to drop this part, and now I've got a new proposal that's integrated some of the reactions. And if we practice integrative decision making really well, we might get, you know, a lot of groups get to a point where the last round, you know, becomes basically just a formality because we hear the reaction so well and we amend our proposal right then. But it's totally okay if that's not happened yet, and objections can be a really helpful way to process. So once we get to the objection round, you're back in your role. And we're going to talk in a second about validating objections. But the idea is you object to say, I think, well, okay, we're going to talk about in a second about objections. So what I was starting to say a second ago about reactions is like, because you're speaking just like from your soul or whatever, and also because of the sort of criteria we're about to talk about with objections, like it could be totally possible in a self-governing group or a group using integrative decision-making, a consensus-based or a consent-based group, to have someone in the reaction round say, I think this is the worst fucking proposal I've ever seen. I'm like, this sucks. I hate it so much. And then get to the objection round and that person have no objections. And like genuinely be at peace with like that proposal going forward. They say like, I hope you know, I think this is terrible. And I'm like looking forward to you coming back and me getting to say, I told you so, but then they still have no objections, right? That's possible. And like even kind of the goal. So how is that possible? Why might that be the case? It's because objections are limited, and they're limited. The limitations on objections really make the difference between consensus and consent. So we're like, and you know what, those are kind of jargony words. So let's just throw those words out the window for a second and say, the limitations that we're about to discuss on objections make the difference between a consensus approach to decision-making and this approach to decision-making. So this is why it's not consensus, is because it doesn't, not anyone can just object, for, you know, say, I don't like it, I'm not willing to have it pass. So what are those limitations? So in order for an objection to be valid, and this is the facilitator's job, to be listening to an objection and say, does it pass this test? In order for an objection to be valid, it has to pass all 4 of these criteria. So any one of these could invalidate an objection. So the first is that the proposal would reduce the capacity of the circle to enact its purpose or accountabilities. So you have to be able to tangibly say, in this way, I'm seeing that in this way, doing this would make it, would make us less able to do what we're here to do, right? Like we would become less effective. And the objector has to be able to say, specifically included in that is my own role. It would limit my own role's ability to, it would limit my ability to enact my purpose or accountability, which is a subdivision of the circle. So like, I'm representing the role that I'm in that circle. So I can't be representing a role I'm in another circle. That's not the role that, like, whatever role I'm filling, or roles I'm filling in that meeting, I'm objecting from those roles. And my role is being a subset. If I meet criteria B, then I've also met criteria A, right? Because my role is a subset of the circle's role or circle's mandate. So if it limits my purpose, my ability to do my purpose and accountabilities, then it therefore limits the circle's ability to do its purpose and accountabilities. The concern does not already exist in the absence of the proposal. So this proposal would create a new problem. And I fear that some of you may have seen this criterion abused by well-intentioned SOS facilitator in the past, because this and the next one are sometimes misunderstood. So if an existing tension would be made worse by the proposal, then it passes this criterion. But if you're saying, well, I don't like this because you know, if we're trying to create a new role and put Susan in it, and I'm like, I don't like this because I don't like being on the same team with Suzanne, sorry. Then like, well, we're already on the same team. So this doesn't create, that's not really a good example. I'm sorry, I came up with a terrible example on the spot, but it you know, both in the sense that it was mean, but also that it didn't accomplish anything. So, but I think you get it. And then finally, the proposal, and when we say, yeah, so it either is definite, it's either like literally but like the proposal itself causes the harm, or the harm that I'm thinking would come about would happen soon enough that we couldn't adapt, or it would like the harm would be done before we could change it. So like Simon and I talked about, so this is basically, these 4 criteria are a big expansion of good enough for now and safe enough to try. And this one is saying it's like, if I'm saying the objection has to be like, if we tried this, the harm would happen before we could adapt, because otherwise it's like, well, let's try it. And the harm would have to be like, really like, you know, because usually it's be like, okay, well, if we tried this, then like our circle would be less effective from, like, say we're in the circle that's tasked with like mobilizing, you know, the mobilization circle. And we're like, if we tried this, I think our ability to mobilize people would be reduced. But if that proved true, then in a month we could just change it. Then I would say that wouldn't pass this criterion. It would have to be like, you know, if we try this, it would be like a proposal to like invest all of our money in some risky stock or something. Like that would be like, oh, and then if we lost all of our money, then we couldn't just like turn it around, right? So it'd have to be like real harm that's like not easily reversible. Objection validations. They seem very technical, right? I copied this language out of the Holacracy Constitution, FYI. So this is the technical language you're here for. So let's take just take a little breath together. I'm going to look at you all and see that you're taking a big breath with me. Yeah, there's a yawn, Simon. All right, good. That was good. That was needed. Okay. Let's talk about these. Let's ask questions. So I've got a question from and just integrated decision making as a whole here.
Yeah, 2 things, I guess. In practice, I very rarely hear people use A and B, pretty much only C and D. So I was just wondering if you can think of an example maybe where A and B might be applicable, and if they're kind of as strict as C and D. And the other thing is, in sociocracy, I believe there is an option to use consent with concern, which is something that's not sort of standard in the SOS, but that some people use sometimes. Wondering if you have anything interesting to say about that.
So consent with concern is like registering. Well, I really think this would happen, but I'm still willing to let it go forward. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's, I mean, I definitely, would encourage that. Like if I'm facilitating a meeting, I tend to be, and you all may have sensed this, like, a disclosure of like where I fall on the kind of one of the many spectra of like just my own sort of personal disposition is like, I tend towards trying things, right? I tend to be in favor of letting things get tried. And so when I'm facilitating, I tend to like gently encourage like, well, is this really not safe enough to try? In order, and like, so that we can revisit it. And there's a caveat there is like, there are groups where like, because of like capacity or because of whatever reason, like they can't, that like if there's just under such a huge backlog of decisions, then like maybe making this decision now means they won't get to revisit it for like 3 months or something. And so that's like an issue to take into account. But generally speaking, I'm pretty pro like, let's really like, yeah. So I encourage that kind of thing. I encourage, okay, like we heard it and like, we'll be mindful of it, and can we still try it? An example of A and B. I mean, if you're not seeing them get referenced by facilitators, my hope is that that's because people are not, that people are, are making their objections, like that's either intuitive or it's like made its way into the culture enough that people are objecting based on mandates. So an example of an objection that didn't pass A or B. One example of an objection that wouldn't pass B is that I can't object on behalf of someone else. So if we're in the Rebel Hive meeting and I'm like, well, I think this proposal would really be bad for Midlands because I know that they have a lot of seniors in their group and this proposal would make XR less hospitable to seniors. I can't do that. Only Etienne and Suzanne can do that. So I could say, in my reaction round, maybe I could say, well, or I could tell them like, hey, don't you think this might happen? But I can only reject out of concern for my role. So like, I have to be representing my role. They might hear me and say, oh, I don't think so. Or like, oh, whatever. I don't, I'm choosing to go with consent with concern. How's that answer?
Yeah, no, that's cool. I think what you said about hopefully it's kind of filtered in that it's not usually necessary to refer to those. I think that's probably the case indeed in the context that I'm thinking about. Thanks.
Cool. Paul?
Regards to reaction round, should you only sort of speak from your heart as opposed to someone else? So I know that you've kind of covered this in the objections, but so it's like, if I was to say, if I was a middle-aged woman, then I would see it this way. Should I just sort of speak from like, where I'm coming from?
You can say like, because that, I assume that like a comment like that would be coming from your heart about your concern for someone else.
Cool.
So you could say, I'm worried that this would affect, like I'm feeling worried because I sense that this outcome or this proposal might affect people who have this need, people who need this.
No, actually, no, yeah. Especially like disability access and stuff. Obviously, that's something.
Right. Yeah. Perfect example. Or like, yeah. Etienne?
So is the reaction part where you kind of, I'm not saying you have to be strict, but you kind of say like, I've heard that's normally where people kind of say, oh, basically that's where it gets changed, right? And the the ideas get integrated and someone might fiddle around with a proposal to make it kind of good enough and happy people can and safe enough to try whatever. So those reactions, someone might say, I feel really bad about it, but they'd have to explain like why, and they'd have to say, because I think it's going to do something. Is that how how does the person using it know what to change? Do you see what I mean? Because I sort of feel like I sort of think that if you say reactions, people just go, yeah, I like it, or I think it's shit, or whatever. But then the person bringing a proposal doesn't know what, you need something from those people reacting, don't you, to be able to change the proposal. Do you see? Yeah. Can you clarify perhaps what the proposer is looking for in those reactions? Do you see what I mean?
Great question, or great observation. So, okay, I had several thoughts now. How can I now wanting to organize them? People don't always know. Okay, we talked about this last week and today. All of this is like the foundation for all of this stuff is trust, and it's like if the trust isn't there, this performance is worth nothing. And if the trust is there, this is kind of just like a technical detail. I think I mentioned like an anecdote that I heard from a teacher who was like studying he was going around studying like different kind of self-organizing methodologies or like decision-making systems, and like had visited lots of groups in the United States and the United Kingdom, and like Anglophone kind of places, and had seen like different versions of different processes like this, and really like a lot of different processes, and he was trying to study the processes. And then he went to like, I think it was Spain, and observed some groups, like some activist groups there. And he was just like, he tells this anecdote, like, I went to a meeting, and it was like an hour-long meeting, and they had decisions to make, and they spent the first 50 minutes of the meeting just like bantering, like making jokes back and forth, and like totally talking. And he was like, this is a mess. Like, this is that, there's no discipline here. Like, they're totally, and then in the last 10 minutes of the hour, they just like made all the decisions like that. And he was like, what just happened? Like, he was totally baffled. And it was just because the trust was, the trust and care and connection was there. The decision making was really easy. So that said, I do still believe in, like, I think this systems like this can serve really well, and they can help integrate objectives, and they can help us move towards, more integrated decisions or whatever. And like the foundation, the trust is like, these things are optional and the trust is not optional. So that said, about like, it's like, if I'm imagining a team that's doing that has like a strong foundation of trust, and someone in a reaction says, wow, I'm just feeling really bad about this proposal, and I can't articulate why. Like, I don't know what it is. I don't know what the harm would, I'm not sure what harm would come, but something just feels really off to me about it. Then like, again, I guess I'm like, the answer I'm having in my head is just highlighting how much it's like not about the decisions, because it could go either way. People could say, okay, I'm hearing, and I want to, I'm still like, the proposer could say, based on that person's like not feeling really bad about it, I want to withdraw it. Like, because I'm just not sure. Like, now I've heard that, now I'm having questions because I really value that person's opinion. Or they could say, I hear that, and I really am still feeling a need to address this. So because that you don't have it specific yet, I do still want to suggest it, but I really want to keep tracking with you. Like, as we try this out, I want you, I really want to keep hearing your perspective on it. And if it does become clear that it's not working, then let's like revisit it. Right. So that's, it's, because people don't always, it's totally possible that someone could say, I just really don't feel good about this, but I'm not sure why. How does that feel, Etienne?
Yeah, I suppose what you're saying is that the proposer might just be like, this is actually really difficult, and there's obviously something missing here that is not hitting the spot in terms of the needs of what this proposal is trying to, hit. I can't put my finger on it. Or they might just have a bash at it there and then and say, okay, if I do this, will that make, is that going to make you feel better? That's kind of what that, or make
right.
it feel like it's working for you. So I think that's what you're saying.
Okay. Wolfgang has to go at 7:30 sharp, which is right now. So great to having you, Wolfgang. I did not expect that this slideshow was going to be twice as long as the last one. I don't know how that happened. Okay, I will send a link to the video afterwards. Okay,
Thank you.
Good. I will definitely send a link. Okay. So an important detail with that is that someone owns a proposal. Like in IDM, we always have an owner proposal, a proposal owner, and only they can amend the proposal. They might say, so yeah, so it's a discussion between the group and them, and they might say like, you know what? So like, okay, say we react and one person's like, well, I really like this proposal. And someone else is like, I really don't like it. And then the proposer is like, okay, I heard someone doesn't like it, so I'm going to drop it. Then maybe the person who liked it would be like, no, I liked it. Now I'm going to bring it. Now I'm going to bring this proposal. And I'm willing to like work, or I think I have a solution, or I really like this amendment or whatever, but no one else can amend the proposer. Only the proposer can like decide, yeah, okay, this is how I want to change it to integrate the people's like the reactions that I've heard. And then in objections, it's not a sufficient objection. Okay, so like back to Mai's question before about criterion A, an objection that wouldn't pass criterion A is, I would really prefer this proposal if it had X amendment to it. Like, I think this amendment would make this proposal better. Even if everyone else, it's like, it doesn't pass the objection. The proposer might hear that and say, oh yeah, I like that proposal, or that I like that amendment, or I don't. But it's not enough to say, I think there's a better proposal out there. Yeah, hopefully that helps.